In the middle of Sri Lanka, rising from the flat jungle of the Matale district like something that was placed there rather than grown, there is a rock. Not a hill, not a ridge, not a gradual rise in the landscape. A rock, a monolith of volcanic gneiss 202 meters tall, its sides almost sheer on three faces and steep on the fourth, its summit a flat platform of approximately 1.5 hectares that is visible from more than 15 kilometers away in clear weather. The rock is old in the way that geological formations are old, hundreds of millions of years old, a remnant of the deep volcanic activity that shaped the interior of the island over immense spans of time. It has been sitting in this particular piece of landscape since long before any human being set eyes on it. In the 5th century of the Common Era, a king named Kashyapa looked at this rock and saw something that no king before him had apparently seen: a palace. Not a palace to be built at the base of the rock, or even on the lower slopes, but a palace to be built on top, on the flat summit 200 meters above the jungle floor, with a view in every direction that extended to the distant mountains and the glittering sea. The king who had this vision, and who had the resources and the will to act on it, was one of the more complex and more tragic figures in the long history of Sri Lanka, a man who had seized power through patricide and who spent the 18 years of his reign building the most extraordinary royal capital in the history of the island, partly as an act of aesthetic and political ambition and partly, it seems, as a kind of elaborate fortification against the brother whose return to reclaim the throne he lived in constant fear of. What Kashyapa built at Sigiriya is still there, in various states of preservation and ruin. The summit palace, reduced to foundations and the remnants of structures whose original form can be partially reconstructed from the surviving stonework and the water channels and the cisterns that served them. The paintings, the extraordinary frescoes of women that cover one protected section of the rock face and that are among the most celebrated examples of ancient painting in South Asia, still vivid despite 15 centuries of exposure. The mirror wall, the polished plaster surface that once reflected the paintings and on which subsequent visitors inscribed their reactions across nearly 1,000 years of visits. The gardens, recognized as the oldest surviving landscaped gardens in the world, their geometric pools and water channels and boulder gardens preserved under the soil for centuries and now partially restored. And the lion staircase, the approach to the summit that passes between the enormous carved paws of a lion, whose head once framed the final ascent to the palace above, a piece of monumental sculpture whose ambition is apparent even in the two paws and the fragmentary base that are all that survived. Sigiriya was occupied as a royal capital for only 18 years. After Kashyapa's death in battle against his returning brother in 495 of the Common Era, it was converted to a Buddhist monastery, which it remained for several centuries, and then gradually abandoned. By the time the jungle had finished with it, most of what Kashyapa had built had disappeared back into the vegetation. What remained was what could not disappear: the rock, and on the rock, the paintings, preserved in a sheltered recess that the jungle could not reach. The rest was recovered only in the 19th and 20th centuries, when archaeologists began the systematic work of understanding what had been built here and in what sequence. The story of Sigiriya is many things. It is the story of a king who built something extraordinary under extreme political pressure and with a compressed timeline that makes the scale of the achievement even more remarkable. It is the story of a rock that was sacred long before any palace was built on it, and that was a place of human activity for thousands of years before Kashyapa arrived. It is the story of the paintings, which are a window into the aesthetic and spiritual world of 5th century Sri Lanka that has no equivalent anywhere in the region. And it is the story of the long rediscovery that has turned Sigiriya from an overgrown ruin into one of the most visited and most studied ancient sites in South Asia. The rock of Sigiriya is the defining fact of the site, and understanding what it is, geologically and physically, is the starting point for understanding everything else about the place. Sigiriya means lion rock in Sinhala, the language of Sri Lanka, and the name reflects both the specific monument that Kashyapa built at its base and a much older tradition of understanding this particular geological feature as a place of power and significance. The rock itself is an Inselberg, an isolated rocky outcrop that rises from the surrounding plain as a result of differential erosion, the surrounding softer rock having been worn away over geological time while the harder gneiss of the Inselberg resisted and remained. The process that produced Sigiriya began hundreds of millions of years ago and continued until the present landscape was established, and the specific form of the rock, its sheer sides and its flat summit, is a product of the specific fracture patterns and mineral composition of the gneiss that was its raw material. The summit of the rock is approximately 1.5 hectares in area, roughly rectangular in plan, and lies at an elevation of approximately 370 meters above sea level, which puts it about 200 meters above the surrounding plain. The views from the summit on a clear day are extraordinary, extending in all directions to the horizon, with the distant mountains of the Central Highlands visible to the south and southwest and the flat coastal plain stretching toward the sea in other directions. The specific quality of being able to see so far in every direction from a position of such physical elevation was clearly central to Kashyapa's choice of the summit as the location for his palace, and the experience of the view from the summit today, even with the surrounding jungle somewhat reduced from its historic extent, gives a clear sense of why this position would have been irresistible to a king who needed to combine defensive advantage with an expression of power and magnificence. The geological character of the rock created both the opportunities and the constraints that shaped what was built on and around it. The summit platform provided a site for the palace, bounded by the natural cliff edge that required no defensive wall on most of its perimeter. The sheer faces of the rock provided surfaces for painting and inscription, protected from direct rainfall by overhanging rock formations in specific locations. The boulders that tumbled from the rock over geological time and accumulated at its base provided materials that were incorporated into the garden design and into the buildings of the lower precinct. The springs that emerged from the rock at various points provided water that could be managed and directed by the sophisticated hydraulic systems that are one of the engineering achievements of the Sigiriya complex. The rock has a sacred character in the Sri Lankan Buddhist tradition that predates the construction of Kashyapa's palace and that continued through and after it. The cave complexes at the base of the rock show evidence of religious use that goes back several centuries before the 5th century, and the conversion of the site to a Buddhist monastery after Kashyapa's death was not an arbitrary choice but a continuation of a sacred geography that had existed before the royal capital was established. Understanding Sigiriya requires understanding it as a place that was significant in multiple overlapping ways, geological and religious and political and aesthetic, and that accumulated meaning over a long period rather than having its significance created from scratch by a single royal patron. Kashyapa I, the king who built Sigiriya, is one of the most vivid and most debated figures in the early history of Sri Lanka, and the story of his life and his reign as it is recorded in the ancient chronicles is a story of ambition, patricide, fear, and extraordinary artistic achievement. The primary sources for the history of Kashyapa are the Sri Lankan chronicles, particularly the Mahavamsa and the Kulavamsa, which are Buddhist historical texts compiled over many centuries that record the history of the island from its legendary origins through the historical period. These chronicles describe Kashyapa as the son of King Datusana, the ruler who had unified much of the island after a period of conflict and who is associated with an ambitious program of irrigation and construction. Kashyapa, who was not the designated heir to the throne, seized power by imprisoning his father and eventually, according to the chronicles, killing him by having him walled up alive in a dam, a deed that the Buddhist chronicle writers describe with horror and that is presented as the original sin of a reign that could never fully escape its consequences. The circumstances of Datusana's death, as recorded in the chronicles, are complicated by the claim that Kashyapa's motive was at least partly the belief that his father had hidden great treasure from him, a claim that the chronicles deny by reporting that when Datusana was brought to the location of the alleged treasure and asked to show it, he extended his arms to indicate the irrigation tank he had built and said that this was his treasure, a gesture of royal pride that the chronicle writers clearly intend to show as a rebuke to the materially motivated patricide of his son. After seizing power, Kashyapa faced the immediate problem of Moggallana, his legitimate half-brother and the designated heir, who had fled to India rather than submit to the usurper. The chroniclers make clear that Kashyapa lived in constant fear of Moggallana's eventual return with an army to reclaim the throne, and it is this fear that the tradition associates with the decision to move the royal capital from the traditional site at Anuradhapura to the remote rock fortress of Sigiriya. The logic is clear in its way. A palace on top of a 200-meter rock is a very difficult place to assault, and the isolation of Sigiriya from the traditional centers of power and population made it harder for any rival to mobilize support against the king within his own capital. The reign of Kashyapa at Sigiriya, from approximately 477 to 495, is described in the chronicles primarily through the lens of its ending. The account of the final battle between Kashyapa and Moggallana, in which Kashyapa descended from his rock fortress to meet his brother's army in open battle and was abandoned by his troops when his elephant turned away from the field, after which he killed himself by falling on his own sword, has the quality of a tragic narrative whose dramatic arc was shaped by the chronicler's understanding of the reign as a punishment for the original crime. Whether the historical events proceeded exactly as the chronicles describe is impossible to verify, but the broad outline of a usurper king who built an extraordinary capital in an isolated location and who was eventually defeated by the legitimate heir is consistent with the archaeological evidence for the brief occupation of Sigiriya as a royal capital. The physical approach to Sigiriya, the sequence of spaces and experiences through which Kashyapa organized the visitor's ascent from the base of the rock to the summit palace, is one of the most sophisticated pieces of spatial planning in the ancient world, and it remains partly legible today in the partially restored gardens and approaches. The outer moat and rampart that defined the boundary of the Sigiriya complex enclosed an area of approximately 3 square kilometers, though occupation and construction were concentrated in the area immediately surrounding the rock. The approach to the rock from the west began in the water gardens, a formal garden complex organized around a series of geometric pools and water channels that used the hydraulic pressure of the springs emerging from the rock to operate a system of fountains and water features that was extraordinary for its time and that has been partially restored in recent decades. The gardens are now recognized by archaeologists as the oldest surviving formal landscaped gardens in the world, predating the famous gardens of the Mughal emperors by more than 1,000 years and representing a tradition of garden design whose sophistication has only recently been fully appreciated. The water gardens were the first stage of a carefully orchestrated spatial experience that continued through a series of distinct garden zones. The fountain gardens, with their elegant limestone pipes that still occasionally work when the water table is high enough, were followed by the boulder gardens, where the enormous granite boulders that had tumbled from the rock over geological time were incorporated into the garden design in ways that used their natural forms as architectural elements, carving cisterns and steps and seats into their surfaces and building walls that connected them into sheltered enclosures. The third zone was the terraced gardens, which followed the natural rise of the ground as the approach came closer to the base of the rock, organizing the slope into a series of level platforms connected by staircases. The Lion Staircase, which gave the rock its name, was reached after passing through the gardens. The approach to the summit ascent passed between the 2 enormous carved paws, each approximately 4 meters wide, of the lion that Kashyapa built at the base of the final ascent. The lion's body rose above the paws in the original construction, framing the staircase with the animal's belly and flanks as a passage between its paws, until the staircase through the lion's open mouth brought the ascending visitor to the summit. Only the paws and a small section of the lower body survived the medieval period, but they are enough to give a powerful sense of the dramatic spatial effect that was intended. Ascending to the palace through the body of a gigantic stone lion was not simply impressive architecture. It was a statement about the nature of the king who had commissioned it and the nature of the experience that his palace offered. The mirror wall, which runs along the spiral staircase that gives access to the painting gallery on the lower rock face, is another element of the spatial sequence that has both practical and symbolic dimensions. The wall was originally covered with a polished plaster surface so smooth and reflective that, according to the ancient descriptions, a person walking along it could see their own reflection. This surface served to reflect the paintings in the gallery opposite, amplifying their effect, and it also became, over the centuries following Kashyapa's reign, the surface on which visitors inscribed their own reflections on what they had seen, creating an extraordinary palimpsest of verse and prose observations that spans almost 1,000 years of visits to the site. The paintings of Sigiriya are the most celebrated element of the site and among the most remarkable examples of ancient painting in the entire Asian world. Understanding them requires understanding both their specific artistic character and the context in which they were created and experienced. The paintings occupy a sheltered pocket in the rock face approximately halfway up the western wall of Sigiriya, protected by an overhanging rock formation that has shielded them from direct rainfall for 15 centuries. In their original extent, they covered a much larger area of the rock face, but most of the paintings were destroyed in the centuries following Kashyapa's reign, and what survives today is a section of approximately 100 meters in length showing 21 female figures, or partial figures, against a background of cloud and sky. The figures are shown from the waist up, their lower bodies disappearing into the cloud formations from which they emerge, and they are engaged in what appear to be ritual activities, holding flowers, bowls, and other objects, with an air of gentle ceremony. The identity of the figures has been debated since the paintings were first described to the scholarly world. The most common interpretation is that they are apsaras, the divine or semi-divine female beings of Buddhist and Hindu cosmology who inhabit the heavens and who are associated with fertility, beauty, and the pleasures of the divine realm. On this reading, the paintings represent the heavenly retinue of the divine presence that the rock embodied, and the experience of encountering them halfway up the ascent to the summit palace was intended to communicate something about the nature of the king who lived above. The palace at the summit was not simply a king's residence. It was, in the cosmological framework that the paintings express, something closer to a divine realm, and the women emerging from the clouds were its inhabitants. An alternative interpretation, proposed by some scholars and consistent with aspects of the evidence, is that the figures represent an idealized image of the women of Kashyapa's court, painted in a celestial context that elevated their worldly status to a cosmic dimension. This reading connects the paintings more directly to the specific social world of the Sigiriya court and sees the heavenly setting not as a literal cosmological claim, but as a form of artistic idealization comparable to the conventions used in other ancient royal art traditions. Whatever the specific identity of the figures, the quality of the painting itself is extraordinary. The colors, ground from mineral pigments and bound with organic materials, have survived 15 centuries in a state that allows the original palette to be appreciated with remarkable clarity. The ochres and reds and creams and whites, applied in a technique that involved laying down a ground color and then working over it with shading and highlight to create the illusion of three-dimensional form, produce figures of considerable psychological presence, women whose individual facial expressions and gestures differentiate them from each other in ways that suggest a sophistication of portraiture rare in ancient art. The flower arrangements they hold and the jewelry they wear are painted with botanical and craft precision that tells us something specific about the material culture of 5th century Sri Lanka. The experience of viewing the paintings today, approaching them along the spiral staircase built into the rock face, the figures appearing one by one as the gallery is revealed by the curve of the path, is an experience whose dramatic character was almost certainly deliberate on the part of whoever planned the painting's placement and approach. The sequence of revelation, the specific scale of the figures relative to the viewer, the play of natural and artificial light in the sheltered gallery. All of these suggest a planned aesthetic experience rather than simply a decorative program. The mirror wall inscriptions are one of the most unusual and most historically significant documents in the history of Sri Lanka, and they deserve extended consideration as a record of how the site and the paintings were experienced across nearly 1,000 years of visits. The polished plaster surface of the mirror wall, running for approximately 80 meters along the gallery approach to the paintings, was inscribed by visitors from at least the 6th century onward. The inscriptions, most of them written in the Sinhala language and script that were developing in this period, are among the earliest surviving examples of Sinhala writing and provide a continuous record of the language's development from the 6th to the 14th century. The content of the inscriptions ranges from simple expressions of admiration for the paintings to more elaborate verses that respond to the figures depicted, occasionally addressing the painted women directly in terms that oscillate between reverence and flirtation, between the register of religious devotion and the register of aesthetic or erotic appreciation. The range of voices in the mirror wall inscriptions is one of their most striking characteristics. They include inscriptions that identify themselves as the work of royalty and high officials alongside those that claim more ordinary social origins, and the variety of perspectives they represent gives a picture of Sigiriya's visitor audience across the medieval period that is unusually socially diverse for a document of this kind. The inscriptions also vary considerably in literary quality, from the accomplished verse of what appear to be trained poets to the more halting efforts of visitors who were proud of their literacy but less accomplished in its deployment. One of the most frequently quoted inscriptions, from a group dated to approximately the 8th century, reads in its original Sinhala as a response to one of the painted figures. It expresses the writer's admiration for the woman depicted, describes her beauty, and ends with a reflection on the transience of human life in the face of such beauty. This combination of aesthetic response and philosophical reflection is characteristic of the best of the mirror wall inscriptions, which can be read as a kind of secular literary tradition operating in parallel with the Buddhist monastic tradition that was the dominant cultural context of the site in the post-Kashyapa period. The fact that these inscriptions survived at all is itself remarkable. The mirror wall, being both a functional architectural element and a surface for inscription, was maintained and protected through the monastic period and continued to receive new inscriptions for as long as the monastery was active. When the monastery was finally abandoned, the inscriptions were preserved by the same process that preserved the paintings, the relative inaccessibility of the gallery and the protection of the overhanging rock from direct weathering. The modern scholarship of the mirror wall inscriptions, which has involved both the physical documentation of the surface and the linguistic and literary analysis of the texts, has transformed them from an archaeological curiosity into one of the primary sources for the history of the Sinhala language and literature. The hydraulic engineering of Sigiriya is one of the aspects of the site that has received less popular attention than the paintings or the Lion Gate, but that represents, in some respects, the most technically sophisticated element of the complex. The water management system at Sigiriya was designed to solve a fundamental problem: how to provide a reliable water supply to a site that was occupied by a large royal court and a working population on and around a large rock in a landscape that received most of its rainfall in seasonal monsoons. The solution that the engineers of the 5th century developed was a system of catchment, storage, and distribution that collected water during the rains and stored it in a series of cisterns on and around the rock, then distributed it through a network of channels and pipes that served the gardens, the palace, and the buildings of the lower precinct. The summit cisterns, carved into the living rock of the summit platform, were the primary storage facility for the palace water supply. These large tanks, some of them many meters across and several meters deep, collected rainwater that fell on the summit platform and stored it against the dry season. The engineering of these cisterns, which required the cutting of large volumes of rock and the sealing of the resulting tanks against seepage, represents a major investment of skilled labor and is a reminder that the Summit Palace, despite its dramatic location, was designed as a functioning residential and administrative facility rather than simply as a symbolic monument. The fountain gardens at the base of the rock are the most visually striking evidence of the hydraulic engineering at Sigiriya, and they are remarkable for an aspect of their design that has only recently been fully understood. The fountains in the garden, which consist of limestone pipes with perforated stone caps that allow water to spray upward, are gravity-fed from a series of serpentine channels connected to the water table through porous limestone. In the right conditions, when the water table is high enough and the channels are clear, The fountains operate entirely by hydraulic pressure without any pumping mechanism, an elegant engineering solution that has been demonstrated to work when the ancient channels are cleared of debris. The specific understanding of hydrostatics that made the Sigiriya fountain system possible is a form of engineering knowledge that was sophisticated even by the standards of contemporary civilizations that are better known for their hydraulic achievements. The Roman world, whose engineering achievements are familiar to most educated people in the West, was certainly capable of comparable work, but the Sigiriya system is among the earliest known examples of this type of pressure-fed fountain design anywhere in the world. And its existence in 5th century Sri Lanka is a reminder that technical knowledge in the ancient world was more widely distributed and more independently developed than a purely Eurocentric perspective would suggest. The Summit Palace of Sigiriya, the building or complex of buildings that occupied the flat platform at the top of the rock during Kashyapa's reign, is the element of the site about which the least is known in detail, and whose reconstruction is the most dependent on inference and analogy. The summit platform covers approximately 1.5 hectares, and the remains visible on it include the stone foundations of multiple structures, the carved cisterns that provided the water supply, and a series of channels and conduits that distributed water from the cisterns to different parts of the platform. The highest point of the summit is a rounded rocky prominence at its northern end, and the largest of the excavated structures, a building of considerable size whose foundations indicate a multi-roomed complex, are concentrated in this area. A large pool, asymmetrically positioned in the platform, is one of the most distinctive features of the summit, and its size and careful construction suggest that it served both practical and ceremonial purposes. The superstructure of the summit buildings, the walls and roofs and interior fittings that would have given the palace its residential and administrative character, has entirely disappeared. In a tropical environment with annual flooding during the monsoon and the intense biological activity of a warm, wet climate, the organic materials, wood and thatch and plaster, of which the superstructure was largely composed, survived only as long as they were actively maintained. The 18 years of Kashyapa's occupation, followed by the Buddhist monastic use of the site in a form that would not have required the maintenance of the original palace structures, and then by the eventual abandonment of the site, was a sequence that guaranteed the complete disappearance of the perishable superstructure within a few centuries. What can be reconstructed from the surviving foundations and from the analysis of the rock-cut features of the summit platform is the basic organizational principle of the Summit Palace, a complex of buildings of different sizes and functions arranged around a central open space and served by a sophisticated water management system. The specific rooms and their functions, the decoration of the interior spaces, the furnishings and the arrangement of the royal household, all of these are lost. But the outlines of a royal residence that was intended to combine the functional requirements of court life with the symbolic requirements of a cosmological statement about the nature of royal power are visible in what remains. The view from the summit, which is the most immediately striking aspect of the experience of visiting Sigiriya today, was presumably at least as striking in the 5th century, and the deliberate exploitation of this view as an element of the palace experience was certainly intended by whoever planned the summit buildings. A king who could look out from his palace in any direction and see his kingdom spread below him, with no other human construction visible at the same height, was making a statement about power that required no further elaboration. The religious and cosmological dimensions of Sigiriya are inseparable from its political dimensions, and the Buddhist tradition that was the dominant cultural framework of 5th century Sri Lanka shaped not only the post-Kashyapa use of the site but also the original conception of the palace complex. The relationship between kingship and Buddhist cosmology in ancient Sri Lanka was one of intimate mutual reinforcement. The king was understood to be a being of exceptional merit, whose elevated status in the human world was a reflection of the accumulated spiritual achievement of many lifetimes, and the king's protection and patronage of the Buddhist Sangha, the community of monks, was the primary religious obligation of the royal office. In return, the Sangha legitimized the king's authority through the religious prestige that its blessing conferred and through the cosmological framework that identified the king's realm with the sacred geography of the Buddhist universe. The specific cosmological interpretation of Sigiriya that has attracted the most scholarly attention is the suggestion that Kashyapa intended the rock fortress to be understood as Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the center of the Buddhist and Hindu universe, and himself as a manifestation of the god Kuvera who was associated with the northern quarter of the cosmos and with the mountain's summit. On this reading, the paintings of the women emerging from clouds are the divine inhabitants of the cosmic mountain, and the entire complex from gardens to summit is an elaborately designed cosmological statement about the nature of the king who inhabited it. This interpretation is supported by some elements of the evidence and contested by others, and the scholarly debate about it reflects broader questions about the relationship between religious symbolism and political performance in ancient South Asian kingship. What is clear is that the visual and spatial program of Sigiriya was not simply decorative or functional but was charged with meaning that went beyond the immediately practical, and that the specific references to divine and cosmic themes in the paintings and in the spatial organization of the approach reflect a sophisticated engagement with the cosmological frameworks of 5th century Sri Lanka. The conversion of Sigiriya to a Buddhist monastery after Kashyapa's death, which is documented in both the chronicles and the archaeological evidence, suggests that the sacred character of the rock did not depend exclusively on the specific cosmological program of the Kashyapa period royal complex. The monks who occupied the site after the palace was abandoned were drawing on a tradition of religious use that predated the palace and that continued after it, and the caves and rock shelters at the base of the rock that show evidence of early Buddhist occupation are the material evidence of a sacred geography that the royal complex had temporarily superimposed on rather than replaced. The rediscovery of Sigiriya by the scholarly world is a process that began in the late 19th century and that has continued to the present, with each generation of researchers adding new dimensions to the understanding of what was built here and why. The specific combination of disciplines required to understand Sigiriya in its full complexity, archaeology, art history, linguistics, hydraulic engineering, ecology, archaeoastronomy, is a combination that no single researcher could encompass and that has required the development of collaborative research programs drawing on expertise from multiple fields and multiple institutions. The picture of the site that has emerged from this collaborative work is significantly richer and more complex than anything that could have been produced by any one of those disciplines working alone, and the continuing development of new analytical methods and new theoretical frameworks means that the understanding of Sigiriya is still developing. The first systematic account of Sigiriya by a Western scholar was produced by the British archaeologist H.C.P. Bell, who visited the site in 1894 and produced a description and plan that introduced the ruins to the international scholarly community. Bell recognized the significance of the paintings and documented the mirror wall inscriptions, though the interpretation of both was left to subsequent generations of scholars. His work established the basic archaeological framework for the site that subsequent research has built on and in many cases revised. The excavation of the gardens, which began in the 1970s under the direction of the Central Cultural Fund of Sri Lanka and the UNESCO Sri Lanka Technical Assistance Program, was the most significant development in the understanding of the site in the 20th century. The gardens, which had been buried under the accumulated soil of more than 1,000 years and were entirely invisible until excavated, revealed a complexity and a sophistication that had not been anticipated from the surviving surface evidence. The discovery of the fountain system, of the geometric water channels, and of the elaborate boulder gardens transformed the interpretation of Sigiriya from a royal palace with some garden features into a comprehensive planned landscape in which the garden was as important as the palace itself. The interpretation of the paintings has been the subject of continuous scholarly attention since Bell's initial documentation. The work of the Sri Lankan art historian Senarat Paranavatana, who produced the first comprehensive study of the paintings in the mid-20th century and proposed the interpretation of the figures as apsaras, established the scholarly consensus that has been the starting point for subsequent debate. The conservation of the paintings, which are vulnerable to humidity, biological growth, and the physical effects of visitor proximity, has been a continuous program of technical work involving both local and international expertise. The mirror wall inscriptions, which were first systematically recorded and translated in the mid-20th century, have become one of the most studied collections of ancient Sinhala text outside the chronicles themselves, and their analysis has produced important contributions to the understanding of the development of the Sinhala language and literature. The specific dating of individual inscriptions, which depends on the identification of linguistic and epigraphic features that were characteristic of different periods, has allowed the inscriptions to serve as a kind of datable record of the development of written Sinhala across nearly 1,000 years. The broader historical context of the Sigiriya period, the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era in South Asia, is essential for understanding the specific character of what Kashyapa built and the tradition within which he was working. Sri Lanka in the 5th century was part of a broader cultural world of Theravada Buddhist civilization that connected it to the mainland Indian traditions from which it had derived its religious and cultural frameworks, while also developing a distinctly Sri Lankan version of those frameworks that was influenced by the island's specific history, language, and social organization. The Anuradhapura period of Sri Lankan history, in which Sigiriya was built, is named for the ancient capital that had been the seat of the island's kings for many centuries, and the political and cultural achievements of this period are among the most important in the island's history. The construction of the irrigation tanks that are one of the most enduring physical legacies of the Anuradhapura period, the massive reservoirs that allowed the systematic irrigation of the dry zone of northern Sri Lanka and that sustained a dense agricultural population in an otherwise marginal environment, was the major economic achievement of the period. Kashyapa's father Datusena is credited in the chronicles with the construction of several major tanks, and his defiant gesture of pointing to a tank as his greatest treasure captures something essential about the priorities of the Anuradhapura period kings, for whom the creation of agricultural infrastructure was both an act of genuine public benefit and a demonstration of royal power that reached every farmer in the kingdom. The connection between Sigiriya and the broader South Asian world of this period is visible in the artistic tradition within which the paintings were created. The Sigiriya paintings are related to the tradition of Buddhist cave painting that produced the Ajanta caves in Maharashtra, the most celebrated examples of ancient Indian painting, and both the stylistic features and the technical methods of the Sigiriya paintings show the influence of a pan-South Asian artistic tradition that was spread by Buddhist networks of patronage and monastic exchange. The specific character of the Sigiriya paintings, their color range, their compositional conventions, their approach to the representation of the human figure, is closely related to the Ajanta tradition while also reflecting local adaptations and developments. The political world of 5th century Sri Lanka was one of considerable instability, with rival claimants to the throne, the persistent influence of South Indian powers on the politics of the island, and the complex relationship between the Sinhalese Buddhist majority and the Tamil Hindu populations of the north and the south, creating a situation in which royal authority was never entirely secure. The specific insecurity of Kashyapa's position, a usurper threatened by a legitimate rival abroad, was an extreme version of a more general political vulnerability that characterized the Anuradhapura period, and the specific response of building an almost impregnable royal capital can be understood as a rational response to real threat rather than simply as an expression of paranoia. The experience of climbing Sigiriya today, following the ancient approaches and ascending the rock to the summit, is one of the more physically demanding and experientially powerful available at any archaeological site in Asia. The approach through the water gardens, even in their partially restored state, gives the first impression of the spatial ambition of the original complex. The geometric precision of the pools, their right-angled channels, and their carefully calibrated relationships with the topography of the site communicates the controlling intelligence of whoever planned them, and the contrast between the formal geometry of the gardens and the wild growth of the surrounding jungle landscape makes the gardens feel like an act of will imposed on a resistant natural environment. The fountains, when they work, which depends on the season and the state of the water table, add a dimension of animated beauty that gives the gardens something of the sensory richness they would have had in the 5th century. The boulder gardens, where the rock's fallen children have been incorporated into a landscape of carved cisterns and ancient walls, have a quality of ancient permanence that the more formal gardens cannot match. The boulders themselves, some of them as large as small buildings, are covered in the kind of lichen and moss that accumulates only over centuries, and their worn surfaces and the carved features cut into them by the 5th century builders give them a quality of deep time that is one of the most affecting aspects of the site. The spiral staircase that gives access to the painting gallery is one of the most dramatic pieces of architectural design at the site. The staircase clings to the vertical face of the rock, its path curving around the rock's surface in a way that reveals the paintings in a carefully choreographed sequence. The exposure of the staircase, with the drop below and the rock face above and the painted gallery visible across a gap in the rock, creates a physical experience that is both exhilarating and slightly vertiginous, an experience whose specific quality was almost certainly deliberate on the part of whoever planned the approach. The final ascent to the summit, after passing the lion paws, involves a near vertical climb on metal staircases fixed to the rock face in recent centuries, and the physical effort required creates an experience whose difficulty is part of its meaning. A palace at the top of a 200-meter rock was never meant to be easily accessible, and the effort of the climb is a reminder of why the summit location was chosen. Its inaccessibility was the point. The view from the summit, when it is finally reached, has the quality of a reward that is proportionate to the effort of reaching it. The inscriptions at Sigiriya extend beyond the mirror wall to include rock inscriptions and graffiti found throughout the complex, and together they form a documentary record that complements and sometimes challenges the chronicle account of the site's history. The earliest inscriptions at Sigiriya, predating the Kashyapa period, are the Brahmi inscriptions found in the cave shelters at the base of the rock that document the early Buddhist religious use of the site. These inscriptions, some of them dating to the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, record donations of cave shelters to the Buddhist community by lay patrons and are among the earliest surviving epigraphic evidence from the Sigiriya area. They establish that the rock was a site of religious significance for centuries before Kashyapa built his palace there, a fact that the chronicles also record but that the inscriptions confirm with the authority of contemporary documentation. The Kashyapa period inscriptions are fewer in number than the monastic inscriptions of the earlier and later periods, which is perhaps not surprising given the short duration of the royal occupation. The most significant is the Sigiriya graffiti that records something of the character of the court life at the palace, giving glimpses of the social world that surrounded the king in his extraordinary fortress and confirming the picture of a sophisticated and culturally active court that the paintings suggest. The medieval inscriptions from the monastic period are the most numerous and include the mirror wall inscriptions already discussed, alongside inscriptions on rocks and boulders throughout the site that record the names of monks and lay donors who visited or lived at Sigiriya during the centuries of the monastery's operation. These inscriptions establish the continuous occupation of the site between the 5th and the 13th centuries, a period during which Sigiriya was an active Buddhist institution rather than an abandoned monument, and they provide the archaeological evidence for the processes by which the royal capital was transformed into a religious center. The reading of these inscriptions, and the development of the scholarly tradition of Sinhala epigraphy that makes their reading possible, is itself a significant intellectual achievement that has been built up over a century of specialist scholarship. The specific challenges of reading inscriptions that were carved over many centuries by writers of varying skills and in a language that was changing throughout the period of inscription require both philological expertise and archaeological context, and the integration of the inscriptional evidence with the archaeological and chronicle evidence for the site's history is an ongoing scholarly enterprise. The wildlife and ecology of Sigiriya adds dimensions to the experience of the site that are easy to overlook in the focus on the human achievements it represents, but that are part of the living reality of a place that has been shared between human occupation and tropical ecology for thousands of years. The experience of watching a group of elephants move through the forest visible from the summit of Sigiriya, their large gray bodies barely distinguishable from the dappled shade of the canopy except when they cross an open clearing, connects the ancient site to the living ecology of Sri Lanka in a way that no amount of architectural description can achieve. The elephants have been here since long before the rock was given a name, and they will be here long after the last human construction has crumbled back into the jungle floor. The jungle that surrounds the rock and that encroaches on the cleared areas of the complex is a dry zone tropical forest, distinct in character from the wetter forests of the island's central highlands and characterized by the specific plant communities adapted to the seasonal drought of the Mat Ale district. The trees, the shrubs, the ground cover that constitutes this forest are not merely background to the ruins, but are the immediate ecological context within which everything at the site exists, and the specific qualities of the forest, its sounds and its smells and the quality of its light, are part of the experience of Sigiriya in ways that no amount of architectural description can fully capture. The wildlife associated with the rock itself includes the small populations of birds that nest in the rock face, whose calls are audible throughout the ascent and whose movements add a dimension of living presence to the vertical surface of the rock. The rock also shelters a population of wasps whose large paper nests are visible in sheltered locations on the cliff face, and the wasps have at various times been a significant deterrent to visitors. Their occasional attacks on ascending groups a reminder that the rock's ecology is not entirely subordinated to the visitor experience. The larger animals of the surrounding forest, elephants, leopards, and the various deer and smaller mammals of the dry zone, are present in the jungle around the site and occasionally visible from the summit, and the experience of looking down from the summit to see elephants moving through the forest below has a quality of temporal depth that no human activity at the site can match. The specific relationship between the rock's ecology and its archaeological preservation is an ongoing concern of the conservation management of the site. The biological processes that accelerate the weathering of the rock face and the painted surfaces, the moisture-retaining properties of the mosses and lichens that colonize the rock, the root forces of the trees that find purchase in the cracks of the stone. All of these are agents of deterioration that the conservation program must manage. The management of vegetation in the immediate vicinity of the most important archaeological features, balancing the ecological value of the surrounding forest with the need to protect the physical fabric of the monuments, is one of the standard challenges of tropical archaeological conservation. The legacy of Sigiriya in the culture and identity of Sri Lanka is profound and multidimensional, reflecting the site's significance both as a monument to the island's ancient past and as a symbol of the specific achievements of Sinhala civilization. The site's designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982 was among the earliest such designations in Asia and placed Sigiriya within a global framework of heritage recognition that has shaped the way it is presented and experienced by international visitors. The development of the interpretation infrastructure at the site, the walkways, the information panels, the conservation displays, reflects an ongoing negotiation between the local cultural significance of the site and the requirements of communicating that significance to an international audience that often arrives without the cultural context to understand what it is seeing. Sigiriya is the most visited archaeological site in Sri Lanka and one of the most visited in South Asia, receiving several 100,000 visitors per year from both within the island and from abroad. Its status as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, inscribed in 1982 among the first group of cultural heritage sites to receive that designation, placed it within the global framework of heritage conservation and established its international significance in terms that governments and international organizations could act on. The development of the site as a tourist destination, with the associated infrastructure of entrance facilities, pathways, interpretation panels, and the security arrangements necessary to protect both the visitors and the monuments, has transformed Sigiriya from an archaeological site accessible primarily to specialists and dedicated travelers into a mass tourism destination, with all the opportunities and challenges that transformation involves. The paintings have been the primary focus of both popular and scholarly interest in Sigiriya, and they have become one of the most iconic images in Sri Lankan cultural life, reproduced on everything from postage stamps to hotel lobbies and representing the artistic achievement of ancient Sri Lanka in the international imagination. The specific aesthetic qualities of the paintings, their combination of sensuous immediacy and spiritual distance, their blend of idealized form and individual characterization, their extraordinary state of preservation, make them an ideal ambassador for the broader cultural achievements of the Anuradhapura period. The political significance of Sigiriya in the context of Sri Lankan history is complicated by the diversity of interpretations of Kashyapa's character and legacy. For some Sri Lankan historians and cultural commentators, Kashyapa is primarily a usurper and a patricide, and Sigiriya is the monument to a morally compromised reign that was justly ended by the legitimate restoration. For others, the extraordinary artistic and architectural achievement of the Kashyapa period makes him one of the great patron kings of Sri Lankan history, regardless of the moral character of his accession to power. This ambivalence about the historical figure mirrors the ambivalence about the monument itself, which is simultaneously a testimony to the achievement of a brilliant reign and a physical expression of the political fear that drove it. The conservation challenges at Sigiriya are among the most complex in South Asian heritage management, reflecting the combination of the specific vulnerabilities of the paintings, the engineering challenges of maintaining the hydraulic systems, and the pressures of large-scale tourism on a fragile ancient site. The paintings are the most immediately vulnerable element of the site and have been the focus of the most intensive conservation effort. The specific threats they face include the biological growth of algae, lichens, and mosses on the painted surface, driven by the moisture that the rock face retains in the humid tropical climate, the chemical deterioration of the mineral pigments and the organic binders in the specific conditions of the gallery microclimate, and the physical effects of visitor proximity, including the carbon dioxide and moisture exhaled by visitors in the enclosed gallery space and the physical contact that occurs when visitors touch or lean against the wall. The conservation program for the paintings has involved a combination of biological treatment to control the growth of microorganisms on the painted surface, chemical consolidation of areas where the painted layer is separating from the rock substrate, and the management of visitor access to reduce the environmental impact of large numbers of people in the enclosed gallery space. The specific technical challenges of treating paintings on a vertical rock face in a tropical climate, with the constraints of visitor management requirements, have required the development of techniques that are specific to this site and that have been developed through a combination of local expertise and international collaboration. The hydraulic systems of Sigiriya present a different kind of conservation challenge. The ancient channels and pipes that form the distribution system of the water gardens are in varying states of preservation, and the restoration that has been undertaken in some sections to make the fountain system functional again has involved both archaeological reconstruction of the original design and practical engineering decisions about how much intervention is appropriate for a heritage site of this significance. The tension between conservation and interpretation, between preserving the site in its current state and making its original character legible to visitors, is felt acutely at Sigiriya, where the dramatic original design of the gardens and the hydraulic system is one of the most important things to communicate. The management of visitor numbers and visitor behavior at a site that receives hundreds of thousands of visitors per year is a challenge that has intensified as Sri Lanka has developed as a tourism destination. The physical fabric of the site, from the gardens at the base to the summit platform, is subject to the cumulative effects of millions of footsteps, of physical contact with ancient surfaces, and of the environmental disturbance that large numbers of visitors introduce. The development of visitor management systems that protect the most vulnerable features while maintaining the quality of the visitor experience is an ongoing balance that the site managers must continuously adjust. The figure of the woman in the Sigiriya paintings deserves its own extended consideration, because the paintings are not only important as works of art and as historical documents, but as one of the very few significant representations of the female body in ancient South Asian art that are preserved in a public, monumental context. The preservation of the Sigiriya paintings over 15 centuries in a public setting, exposed to the gaze of an unknown but certainly very large number of visitors, gives them a different character from the painted women of manuscript traditions or private collections. These figures have been seen, continuously, since the day they were painted, and the mirror wall inscriptions are the record of that continuous seeing, evidence that the paintings provoked real aesthetic and emotional responses in real people across a span of nearly 1,000 years of visitation. The conventions of representation used in the Sigiriya paintings place them squarely within the tradition of ancient Indian figure painting, a tradition in which the female form is represented according to a set of aesthetic ideals that encode both religious and erotic values. The specific physical features celebrated in this tradition, the full breasts, the narrow waist, the rounded limbs, the specific gestures of hands and fingers, are present in the Sigiriya figures and connect them to a pan-South Asian aesthetic that was codified in the literary and artistic treatises of the period. But within these conventional parameters, the Sigiriya painters achieved a degree of individual characterization and psychological subtlety that elevates the paintings beyond the merely conventional. The facial expressions of the Sigiriya women are one of the most discussed aspects of the paintings. The specific combination of inward-turned gaze and slight smile that characterizes many of the figures has been variously interpreted as expressing religious devotion, erotic awareness, or simply the aesthetic of serene beauty that was the ideal of ancient Indian figure painting. What is clear is that the painters were working at the highest level of the tradition within which they operated, and the specific physiognomic choices they made, the shapes of the eyes, the modeling of the cheeks, the set of the lips, reflect a sophisticated understanding of how facial expression communicates interiority that is rare in ancient art. The jewelry and accessories worn by the figures have been studied by art historians and material culture scholars as evidence for the specific luxury goods of 5th century Sri Lanka. The flower arrangements held by some of the figures have been identified by botanists as specific species native to the island, providing a connection between the paintings and the material world of 5th century Sri Lanka that extends beyond the purely aesthetic. The specific hair ornaments, earrings, necklaces, and armlets depicted are consistent with the jewelry traditions of the period as documented by comparable objects in museum collections, and they give the paintings a quality of material specificity that reinforces their character as historical documents alongside their character as works of art. The question of what life was like at the Sigiriya court during the 18 years of Kashyapa's occupation is one that the direct evidence can only partially answer, but the combination of the archaeological, textual, and art historical evidence allows some elements of that life to be reconstructed. The court at Sigiriya was, by the standards of any 5th century royal establishment in Asia, an elaborate institution. The king was surrounded by the full apparatus of royal household management, the attendants of the inner chambers, the officials of the administrative machinery, the religious specialists who managed the ritual calendar, the military commanders responsible for the security of the fortress, and the craftspeople and artists whose skills maintained the visual and material splendor that was expected of a royal court. The 18-year occupation of the site was sufficient time for a settled court life to develop its characteristic routines and its characteristic culture. The paintings, read as a reflection of the court culture that produced them, suggest a world of considerable refinement. The flower arrangements, the elaborate jewelry, the specific garments depicted are evidence of a material culture that valued beauty and had the resources and the craft skills to produce it. The literary culture represented by the mirror wall inscriptions, including the verses written in response to the paintings during the monastic period but reflecting a literary tradition that was active in the court period, suggests a world in which aesthetic cultivation was valued alongside political and military competence. The specific challenge of maintaining a court on a rock fortress 200 meters above the jungle floor would have imposed specific practical constraints that shaped the character of court life in ways not fully captured by the chronicle accounts. The logistical requirements of supplying the summit with food, water, and the materials needed for construction and maintenance were substantial, and the practical limitations on the number of people who could be accommodated on the summit platform meant that the court was of necessity smaller and more concentrated than a conventional royal court established in a valley setting. The specific social dynamics of a court in which everyone was physically close to each other and physically isolated from the broader population of the kingdom would have been distinctive. The fear that the chronicles attribute to Kashyapa, his constant awareness of Moggallana's eventual return, would have been a psychological pressure that shaped the atmosphere of the court in ways that cannot be fully recovered from the material record. A king who built his palace on a mountain to protect himself from his brother was a king who could not fully relax even in his extraordinary creation. And the combination of the magnificent achievement of Sigiriya with the specific anxiety that drove its construction gives the site a psychological complexity that makes it more interesting as a historical phenomenon than a straightforwardly triumphant royal monument would be. The broader significance of Sigiriya in the history of world architecture is an argument that deserves to be made more explicitly than it usually is in the popular literature on the site. Sigiriya is typically presented as a curiosity, a remarkable achievement in an unusual location, but its significance for the history of architecture and landscape design is more substantial than this framing suggests. The water gardens of Sigiriya, as the oldest surviving formal landscape gardens in the world, represent a contribution to the history of designed landscape that predates the better-known garden traditions of the Islamic, Mughal, and European worlds by centuries. The specific design principles used at Sigiriya, the integration of geometry and water, the use of topography as an organizing element, the relationship between the formal garden and the natural landscape that surrounds it, are design principles that appear independently in later garden traditions and whose early expression at Sigiriya is evidence of the independent development of sophisticated landscape design in the South Asian tradition. The paintings of Sigiriya, within the broader history of world painting, represent a moment of extraordinary achievement in a tradition that is far less well known internationally than the contemporary traditions of the Mediterranean world. The quality of the Sigiriya paintings is comparable to the best of what was being produced anywhere in the world in the 5th century, and their specific contributions to the history of portraiture, of the representation of the female form, and of the use of color in fresco painting are contributions that deserve to be evaluated against the full range of ancient painting rather than simply in relation to the South Asian tradition. The hydraulic engineering of the site, and particularly the pressure-fed fountain system, represents an early and independent development of a technology that appears in other ancient traditions at roughly the same time but cannot be attributed to influence from those traditions given the specific context of the design. The Sigiriya fountains are early evidence of an understanding of hydrostatic pressure that was applied to decorative purposes, a combination of scientific understanding and aesthetic ambition that is characteristic of the great engineering traditions of the ancient world. The integration of all of these elements, garden, palace, painting, engineering, cosmological symbolism, into a single planned complex that operates simultaneously at multiple levels of meaning and experience, is itself an architectural achievement that has few parallels in the ancient world. Sigiriya was designed as a total experience, in which every element contributed to an overall effect that was both practically functional and symbolically charged, and the degree of planning and coordination required to achieve this effect across a complex of this scale and ambition is evidence of an architectural tradition of considerable sophistication. The afterlife of Sigiriya in the imagination and culture of Sri Lanka is as interesting as the history of the site itself, and the different ways in which the site has been interpreted and appropriated across the centuries since its abandonment tell us something important about the relationship between ancient monuments and the communities that inherit them. The Buddhist monastic tradition that occupied Sigiriya after Kashyapa's death did not simply use the site as a convenient location. It developed its own relationship to the place that involved both the continuation and the transformation of the meanings that the Kashyapa period had attached to it. The monks who lived in the caves at the base of the rock and who made the ascent to the painting gallery were engaging with a sacred landscape whose character had been permanently altered by the royal occupation, but that retained the older sacred associations that had drawn religious communities to it before the palace was built. The mirror wall inscriptions, in which the monks and their lay visitors responded to the paintings with verse that oscillated between religious devotion and aesthetic appreciation, are evidence of a relationship to the Kashyapa heritage that was neither simple endorsement nor simple rejection but a complex cultural negotiation. The medieval Sri Lankan literary tradition made Sigiriya a setting for a range of stories and legends that used the site's specific character, its isolation, its dramatic physical presence, its association with a king who had committed a terrible crime, as material for narrative and moral reflection. The specific image of Kashyapa building a palace on a rock to escape his crimes is an image that appears in Sri Lankan literature as a symbol of the futility of trying to escape the consequences of moral transgression, a reading that is consistent with the Buddhist-inflected chronicle account of the reign. The modern Sri Lankan engagement with Sigiriya has been shaped by the specific dynamics of post-colonial national identity formation, in which the ancient achievements of Sinhala civilization have been mobilized as evidence of the depth and the dignity of the island's historical tradition. The paintings, in particular, have become a symbol of the aesthetic achievement of ancient Sri Lanka that is displayed and celebrated in contexts that range from the political to the commercial, and their status as one of the most significant surviving examples of ancient South Asian painting gives them a cultural authority that extends well beyond their specific historical context. The silence of Sigiriya is a layered silence, composed of different kinds of absence that have accumulated on top of each other across 15 centuries. The layers go further back than Kashyapa. Before the court was the monastery, and before the monastery were the cave-dwelling monks of earlier centuries, and before them were whatever people came to the rock in the age before writing left any record. Each of these presences left something, carved into the stone or painted on the rock face or inscribed on the polished plaster of the mirror wall, and each of these presences became a silence when it ended, a silence that was added to the silence of everything that came before it. There is the absence of the court, the people who filled this rock with the noise and the activity of royal life for 18 years and then disappeared. The sound of the palace, the voices of the king and his attendants, the sounds of construction and maintenance that would have been constant during the building phase, the ceremonial music that accompanied the rituals of the royal calendar. All of this is gone so completely that it requires an active effort of historical imagination to hear it. There is the absence of the monks, who replaced the court and occupied the rock for several centuries in a different register of sound, the chanting of the suttas, the bells of the monastic schedule, the quiet of the meditation hours. The monastic community had its own sounds and its own silences, and both have been absorbed into the same emptiness that took the sounds of the court. And there is the specific silence of the paintings gallery, the hushed quality of a space where something exceptional was made and preserved, where the accumulated attention of 15 centuries of visitors has given the air a quality of concentrated significance that is different from the ordinary silence of an uninhabited place. The women in the paintings have been looking out from the rock face for 15 centuries, and the silence around them is the silence of their continuous presence and their continuous looking. The specific quality of silence at Sigiriya is also shaped by the sounds that are present, the calls of the birds that nest in the rock face, the wind that moves through the rock on exposed days, the faint sounds of the water in the fountain channels when they are working. These sounds do not fill the silence but reveal its depth, giving the visitor a sense of the specific character of this place that no description can substitute for. Standing at the summit and listening to the wind and the birds and the distant sounds of the forest below is one of the more complete archaeological experiences available in Asia, an experience that connects the visitor to the deep history of a place through the most immediate of the senses. The relationship between Sigiriya and the other major archaeological sites of the Anuradhapura kingdom illuminates the specific character of the Sigiriya complex and the ways in which it both drew on and departed from the broader traditions of royal and religious construction in ancient Sri Lanka. The triangle formed by Anuradhapura to the northwest, Sigiriya in the center, and Polonnaruwa to the southeast encompasses the core of the ancient Sinhalese Buddhist civilization, and the three sites together give a picture of that civilization across different periods and through different kinds of royal ambition. Anuradhapura is the deep foundation, the longest occupied and most multi-layered of the three. Sigiriya is the concentrated flash of a single reign, extraordinary in its intensity and brevity. Polonnaruwa is the medieval flourishing, the second great period of Sinhalese royal achievement that produced its own monuments of comparable ambition in the centuries after Sigiriya was abandoned. Anuradhapura itself, the ancient capital from which Kashyapa departed when he chose Sigiriya as his new seat, is one of the largest and most important ancient cities in South Asia. a site of continuous occupation from at least the 4th century before the Common Era to the 10th century of the Common Era that accumulated over 1,000 years of royal and religious construction into a landscape of extraordinary archaeological density. The Great Dagobas, the dome-shaped reliquary mounds that are the characteristic monumental form of Theravada Buddhist civilization, rise from the Anuradhapura plain in sizes that rival anything in the ancient world, their white plastered surfaces visible for many kilometers. The sacred Bo tree, planted according to tradition from a cutting of the original tree under which the Buddha achieved enlightenment, is one of the oldest documented trees in the world and one of the most sacred sites in the Buddhist world. The contrast between Anuradhapura and Sigiriya illuminates what was exceptional about Kashyapa's choice of site and his approach to royal representation. Anuradhapura is a city in the conventional sense, a dense urban settlement with a complex spatial organization of palaces, religious institutions, administrative buildings, and residential areas that accumulated over many centuries of continuous occupation. Sigiriya is something else, a concentrated statement made in a short time at an impractical location, the product of a single vision pursued with extraordinary intensity. The difference is not simply one of scale but of architectural philosophy, the difference between a capital that grew organically over centuries and a capital that was conceived and executed as a unified design. The relationship between the two sites in the political geography of the kingdom gives an additional dimension to this contrast. Anuradhapura represented the legitimate political tradition from which Kashyapa had separated himself, and the choice of a new capital at Sigiriya was in part a statement of independence from that tradition, an assertion that the king's authority did not depend on the inherited sacred geography of the ancient capital. The return to Anuradhapura after Kashyapa's defeat, with Moggallana restoring the traditional capital, was therefore not merely a practical decision but a symbolic restoration of the legitimate order that Kashyapa had disrupted. The astronomical and calendrical dimensions of the Sigiriya complex, while less fully studied than the paintings or the hydraulics, are increasingly recognized as an important element of the site's design that connects it to the broader tradition of astronomically informed architecture in ancient Asia. The king in the Anuradhapura tradition was not simply a political ruler but a cosmic figure, responsible for the correct alignment of human affairs with the rhythms of the universe. This responsibility was expressed architecturally in the orientation of major buildings and spaces toward significant points in the astronomical calendar, and the evidence that the Sigiriya planners shared this tradition of astronomically informed design places the complex within a broader intellectual and cosmological framework that gives its spatial organization additional layers of meaning. The orientation of specific structures and features within the Sigiriya complex has been analyzed by archaeoastronomers working on the site in recent decades, and while the conclusions of this work are still debated in some details, the broad finding that the layout of the site incorporates deliberate astronomical alignments is consistent with what is known about the role of astronomical observation in ancient South Asian royal practice. The king in the Anuradhapura period tradition was responsible for the correct performance of the ritual calendar, which was organized around the astronomical events of the solar and lunar cycles, and the architectural expression of astronomical knowledge in the design of royal complexes was a way of making the king's mastery of time visible in the landscape. The specific alignments that have been proposed for Sigiriya include orientations of the main water garden axes toward the sunrise and sunset points at the equinoxes, and of specific structures on the summit platform toward the positions of particular stars at the times of their annual heliacal rising or setting. The equinoctial alignments of the garden are the most clearly supported by the evidence, and they connect the garden design to a tradition of equinoctially oriented landscape design that appears in other ancient cultures and that reflects the fundamental importance of the equinoxes as agricultural and ritual markers in most ancient calendar systems. The relationship between the paintings and the astronomical knowledge of the period is another area of inquiry that has produced interesting if not yet definitive results. The cloud formations from which the painted women emerge have been interpreted by some scholars as representations of specific astronomical phenomena, the clouds of the rainy season that mark specific points in the agricultural and ritual calendar, rather than simply as aesthetic devices. On this reading, the paintings encode a seasonal or astronomical significance that would have been immediately legible to a 5th century viewer familiar with the visual vocabulary of the period, but that requires reconstruction from the outside. The question of who built Sigiriya, in the practical sense of which artisans, engineers, and laborers were responsible for the specific skills and techniques visible in the complex, is one that the evidence addresses only partially, but that is worth engaging with because it raises important questions about the organization of skilled labor in 5th century Sri Lanka. The paintings of Sigiriya were clearly the work of highly trained artists operating within a tradition of figure painting that required years of apprenticeship and that was transmitted within specific workshops or court studios. The technical mastery visible in the best preserved sections of the paintings, the specific application of the mineral pigments to create the illusion of three-dimensional form, the handling of the organic binders to achieve the specific surface quality that has allowed the paintings to survive, the compositional decisions that place the figures in their landscape of clouds and sky. All of these reflect skills that were not improvised but were the product of a sustained training tradition. The artists who painted Sigiriya were professionals, working within a specific craft tradition, and they were almost certainly not from Sigiriya itself but were brought from the established centers of artistic production, likely including workshops in the Anuradhapura tradition and possibly including artists who had training in the broader South Asian painting tradition that connected Sri Lanka to the mainland. The engineers responsible for the hydraulic systems and the stone construction of the complex were similarly specialists whose skills were developed within specific craft traditions. The knowledge of hydraulics required to design the Sigiriya fountain system was not common knowledge but specialized expertise, and the engineers who applied it at Sigiriya were drawing on a tradition of water management engineering that had been developing in Sri Lanka since the construction of the ancient irrigation tanks. The stone carvers who cut the cisterns and the channels and the decorative features of the boulder gardens were working within a tradition of rock-cut architecture that had deep roots in the South Asian world. The labor force for the construction itself, the workers who moved the earth for the gardens, who carried the building materials, who maintained the water systems during construction, was almost certainly drawn from the general population of the kingdom through some form of tribute labor system comparable to those documented for other ancient South Asian state construction projects. The 18-year timeline of the construction, combined with the scale of what was built, suggests a large and sustained labor investment that could only have been organized through the mobilization of royal tributary obligations. The world that Sigiriya occupied, the 5th century Indian Ocean world of monsoon trade and Buddhist exchange networks, gives the site a global context that is not always visible from within the specific history of Sri Lanka. The specific timing of Kashyapa's reign, in the second half of the 5th century, placed Sigiriya in a broader world that was also the world of the late Roman Empire's final decades, of the Gupta Empire at its height in northern India, of the formation of the kingdoms that would eventually become medieval Southeast Asia. The cultural exchanges that characterized this period, the movement of artistic traditions, religious ideas, and technical knowledge across the Indian Ocean world, were the medium in which the Sigiriya tradition was formed, and the specific achievements of Sigiriya can only be fully understood in the context of this interconnected ancient world. Sri Lanka in the 5th century was not a peripheral or isolated society but a central node in the Indian Ocean trading and cultural exchange network that connected the Roman Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, the Indian subcontinent, and the trading ports of Southeast Asia. The island's position astride the sea lanes between the Indian subcontinent and the rest of the Indian Ocean world gave it a strategic commercial importance that generated the wealth that funded the extraordinary construction programs of the Anuradhapura period. The island was a major producer and exporter of spices, especially cinnamon, as well as of gemstones, elephants, and other luxury goods that were in demand across the ancient world. The Buddhist exchange networks that connected Sri Lanka to the rest of the Theravada Buddhist world were as important as the commercial networks in shaping the cultural character of the island's civilization. Sri Lanka was one of the primary centers of Theravada Buddhist scholarship and practice in the ancient world, and the Pali language canon that was compiled and maintained at Anuradhapura was the authoritative version of the Theravada scriptures on which Buddhist communities from mainland Southeast Asia to the Himalayan region depended. The monks who traveled between Sri Lanka and these other centers of Theravada practice carried not only texts but artistic and architectural traditions, and the specific connections visible in the Sigiriya paintings to the broader tradition of Buddhist cave painting across South and Southeast Asia are evidence of the cultural exchange that these monastic networks facilitated. The specific role of the Sigiriya site within these networks was shaped by its character as both a royal monument and a Buddhist religious site. The monastery that occupied the site after Kashyapa's death was not a minor local institution, but was connected to the broader Buddhist world of the island and beyond, and the tradition of visiting and inscribing the mirror wall that produced the extraordinary epigraphic record was not simply a local practice but reflected the broader monastic culture of a tradition in which travel between religious sites was a normal and valued activity. The summit of Sigiriya at dawn, before the first visitors have made the ascent and before the day's heat has built to its full tropical intensity, is one of the experiences that makes the long journey to this remote place entirely worthwhile. The rock catches the first light of the day earlier than the surrounding jungle, and in the minutes before sunrise the summit platform has a quality of illuminated stillness that is specific to high, isolated places in tropical landscapes. The mist that fills the lower ground in the hours before dawn is still visible from above, the jungle below reduced to a soft gray-green surface from which the occasional tree crown emerges, and the distant mountains of the central highlands are visible in silhouette against the brightening eastern sky. The birds that roost in the rock face begin to call in the few minutes before the sun appears, and their voices, in the specific acoustic environment of the summit, have a quality of isolated clarity that is unlike any other sound. When the sun appears, the quality of the light changes rapidly. The mist burns off quickly, and within an hour of sunrise the landscape below the rock has resolved into its full tropical detail, the geometry of fields and tanks visible in the cleared areas, the closed canopy of the dry zone forest extending in all directions to the limits of visibility. The rock itself, which was cool in the pre-dawn hours, begins to absorb the heat of the sun, and the temperature of the summit rises toward the levels that make the midday visit uncomfortable. The foundations of the summit palace, in this light and at this hour, have a quality of intimate presence that the busier visiting hours cannot provide. The rock-cut cisterns are pools of shadow in the brightening light. The channels that carried water from the cisterns to the various parts of the palace are legible as incisions in the rock surface, their direction and their careful gradient still communicating the hydraulic intelligence that designed them. The large pool near the northern end of the summit reflects the sky. What is present here, in the early light on the summit of Sigiriya, is not simply the physical evidence of what was built, but the specific quality of a place that was understood by its builder as a peak of the world, a point of elevation above the ordinary landscape that was both literally and symbolically the highest position available to a human being who had claimed for himself the authority and the ambitions of a king. Whatever else Kashyapa was, whatever the moral accounting of his reign, he chose this place and he made something extraordinary in it, and the extraordinary quality of what he made is still present, 15 centuries later, in the stones and the paintings and the carved water channels of the most remarkable ancient monument in the Indian Ocean world. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.